Chapter 4, Genesis chapters 2 through 4. Adam is Israel. When we move from Genesis chapter 1 to Genesis chapters 2 through 4, better known as the story of Adam and Eve and their sons, Cain and Abel, we might have feelings of deja vu. How can Genesis chapter 2 be the account of generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created? In chapter 2, verse 4. Weren't the heavens and the earth created in Genesis chapter 1? And to complicate things further, these two sections have some important differences. For example, the order of creation is different in the two accounts. In Genesis 1, vegetation is created on day 3, chapter 1, verses 12 and 13, animals on days 5 and 6, and then humans, male and female, as a finale on day 6 in chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. In Genesis chapter 2, however, one human, the man, aka Adam, is created before vegetation, chapter 2, verses 5 through 9, and before the animals, which Adam names, chapter 2, verses 19 through 20. When it was clear that no suitable partner for Adam could be found among them, only then does God create the woman from Adam's side, chapter 2, verses 21 through 25. And if we take a step back from the details, we see that not just the order of events is different, the whole feel of Genesis chapter 2 is different. In Genesis chapter 1, God is a high and lofty sovereign who moves things around and creates simply by God's verbal command, "Let there be." In Genesis chapter 2, God is more human-like. God is more involved in the action on the ground. God forms Adam from dust and Eve from Adam's side, like a sculptor or potter. God plants a garden and can be found taking a stroll in it in the evening, in chapter 3, verse 8. Why do we have two very different creation stories side by side at the very beginning of the Bible? Is someone trying to confuse us? Or did an editorial team get sloppy? No, probably not. And as we will see a little later in Genesis, when editors put together two stories that appear similar but are really quite different, we should respect the difference that the editors are allowing to let stand. If we try to reconcile the differences by harmonizing these two chapters, we will be working against the editor's purposes, and thus risk missing the point they are trying to make. So, what's up with Genesis chapter 2? What is the story trying to say? Genesis chapter 2 is not another version of the creation of cosmos. It shifts the focus to the story of Israel. Genesis chapter 2 is actually the older of the two stories, probably written early in Israel's history when Israel still had kings, centuries before the Babylonian exile. Genesis chapter 1, even though it comes first in our Bible now, was written later under the shadow of the Babylonian exile, as we saw last chapter. When the Bible was put together as we know it today, Genesis 1 was made the grand introduction to Israel's story. The God of Israel is the true creator of all things, the master chaos tamer. Whereas Genesis chapter 1 sets up the big picture, Genesis chapter 2 moves quickly to the real heart of the Pentateuch and the whole Old Testament, the story of Israel as God's people. We know it sounds odd to think of the story of Adam and Eve as focusing on Israel. Israel isn't even mentioned, for goodness sake. But if we read the story carefully, keeping our ancient eyes open, we will see there is more going on than we might be used to seeing with our modern eyes. we will see that the story is the story of Israel in miniature. Wait! Don't throw your book down! Come back! Hang with us! We didn't cook this idea up ourselves. Ancient readers and modern scholars alike have seen it too. To see why, we have to jump ahead in the story for just a minute to the story of Adam's son, Cain. Cain is not alone. The story of Cain and his brother Abel, chapter 4, verses 1 through 26, shows us that the story of their parents, Adam and Eve, is not about the creation of the first humans. After Cain kills his brother Abel and is found out, God banishes him to become a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, in verse 12. In response, Cain becomes paranoid, afraid that anyone who meets me will kill me, in verse 14. So God puts a mark on Cain's head to let everyone know to keep their hands off. Cain is satisfied with that, wanders off, and settles in the land of Nod, which means wandering in Hebrew, east of Eden. Yes, that's where the Steinbeck novel and James Dean movie comes from. He finds a wife, settles down, has kids, and builds a city. Verse 17. If you have ever read this story to inquisitive children, you know what's coming next. The dreaded question that terrified Sunday school teachers pray is never asked. Where did Cain get his wife from? I don't know, Susie, ask your parents. Along with that question, we can also add, where did this posse come from that Cain is so afraid of, and why exactly would one man in exile build a city? Even children recognize that if Adam and Eve were the first humans, and if Cain and Abel were their children, and if Abel is dead, that leaves 3 people on earth. So Genesis chapter 4 just drops a bunch of other people in our laps without bothering to explain where they came from. Some who still want to read Genesis chapters 2 through 4 as another account of creation find an answer in Genesis chapter 5, verse 4, where we learn that Adam had other sons and daughters. So, are we supposed to believe that Cain married his sister? Besides the fact that that's gross and a little creepy, let's also remember the story doesn't say that or even suggest it. That is a made-up explanation. And besides, Genesis chapter 5 verse 4 seems to say that these other children were born after Seth, Adam and Eve's replacement child for Abel. All of that happened after the banishment of Cain and his marriage to his mysterious wife. And finally, think about this. For Cain to find a wife among his sisters while wandering around as a fugitive would mean that at least one sister, actually a lot of brothers and sisters since Cain builds a city, would have to have been banished too. But again, the story doesn't say any of that. Here's a simpler explanation. There were other people living outside of the Garden of Eden all along, even if the story doesn't explain it. Which leads to this. Maybe the story of Adam and Eve isn't about the first human beings. Maybe it's about something else. And that something else is this. The Adam story is a story of Israel in miniature, a preview of coming attractions. Adam is Israel. Try to forget what you know about the Adam story and look at the basic plot line. Adam is created by God outside of the garden and then put into a garden paradise. Eden means something like abundance. When he enters this paradise, he is given a command to follow, not to eat of one of the 2 trees in the middle of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. On the day he eats of it, God warns Adam, "You will die." Chapter 2, verse 17. So far, so good. But notice what happens on the day Adam eats the forbidden fruit. He doesn't die. In fact, Adam lives to the ripe old age of 930 and has children. So, what does it mean to die on the day he eats of it? Death, as we read in the story, has a double meaning. On one level, it means physical death because being banished from the garden means that they no longer have free access to that other tree we read about, the tree of life. That is the tree that keeps them from dying. So, in a way, Adam and Eve die physically by being evicted from paradise. They can't keep eating the fruit that gives immortality, and so mortality is introduced. They will eventually return to dust in chapter 3, verse 19. But death also has another meaning, a metaphorical meaning. To be exiled from paradise is death for Adam. This actually does happen on the day Adam and Eve are driven out of the garden and not allowed to return, lest they eat of the tree of life in chapter 3, verses 22 through 24. The death they experience, in other words, is exile from the garden, a kind of death. In Ezekiel chapter 37, we see the same connection between death and exile, though here it is Israel's exile to Babylon. The prophet Ezekiel has a vision of a valley of dry bones, a mass uncovered grave. The bones represent Israel in exile in Babylon. Why would Israelites say that exile is death? Exile was not like being relocated today. Israel was a people of the land, the very land God gave them as a gift. The story of Israel virtually begins with the promise of land given to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, God promises that the Israelites would have the land as God's gift forever and have a descendant of David sitting on the throne. But in exile, all that was gone, including the temple, where Israel went to communicate with God and make sacrifices for the forgiveness of sins. Being in exile was a big deal, and they felt God had rejected them. God had finally turned God's back and walked away. Without God, Israel ceased to exist, so to speak. Israel is dead. But these bones in Ezekiel chapter 37 are brought back together, covered with muscle and flesh, and God breathes life back into them. Verses 7 through 9, as God breathed life into Adam. Bringing the bones back to life represents Israel returning from captivity. See verses 11 through 14. Israel is restored, reconnected with God, brought back to life. Like Israel in exile, Adam did die the day he ate the fruit. He too was exiled from Eden. Adam and Israel share the same fate. But the parallel between Adam and Israel doesn't end there. The stories of Adam and Israel follow the same plot line. Adam was created by God and exiled from paradise for disobeying the command. Israel was created by God and exiled from Canaan for disobeying the law of Moses. Israel was created by God, beginning with Abraham, and then especially when delivered from the dust of slavery, it was a long process. God then took the Israelites to Mount Sinai, where, through Moses, he gave them commands to follow. He placed them in the land of Canaan, a land flowing with milk and honey, which means the land was lush, with two valuable sources of abundance and life in the ancient world: cattle and agriculture. Honey means fruit nectar. As long as Israel obeyed God's law given to Moses, especially the parts about having no other gods but Yahweh, it would go well for them in the land. But Israel had a long habit of worshiping other gods. After several centuries of this, God finally drove Israel into exile in Babylon. Just as I led Adam into the Garden of Eden and commanded him, and he transgressed my commandment, whereupon I punished him by dismissal and exile, so also did I bring his descendants into the land of Israel and command them, and they transgressed my commands, and I punished them by dismissal and exile. From Genesis Rabbah. Adam and Israel mirror each other. Both were created by God and given a great plot of land to live in as long as they obeyed God. The Adam story may not be so much about humanity as it doesn't feel like history and certainly not science, what modern eyes tell us. It has to be read through ancient eyes. The Adam story is a preview of Israel's story, a story of possession of land tied to obedience to God. Now, let's come at this same idea, but from a different angle. Naive Adam and Eve. Many Christians are taught to read the Adam and Eve story something like this. Adam and Eve are fresh off the assembly line, shiny, new, perfect first human beings, sort of superhumans. God tested these flawless creatures with this command not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, just to see if they meant business and would obey God. But they failed the test, rebelled against God, and lost not only their own perfection, but also that of every other human being born since. This way of understanding the Adam story has been very popular for a long time in Western Christianity, especially under the influence of St. Augustine, who lived from Common Era 354 to 430, who said that not only did humanity inherit a sinful nature from Adam and Eve, but also the guilt of their actions, and that's how all humans are born. But not everyone has read the story like this, like many in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and frankly, it's hard to read the story at face value and see how this reading makes sense. Another angle, one often taken by Christians in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, is to read the Adam story as not being about a fall down from perfection, but a failure to grow up in godly wisdom and maturity. Think of Adam and Eve not as perfect superhumans, but as young, naive children who were meant to grow into obedience, but were tricked into following a different path. Why in the world would anyone read the Adam story this way? Well, as we are about to see, there are a few reasons, and they help us see more clearly that we are actually reading the story of Israel. Look at the command God gave Adam. He can eat of any tree of the garden, any tree at all, except one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This raises an obvious question. Why that tree? How about a command not to eat of the tree of death and disease, or the tree of sexual lust and lying? Why the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? What exactly is wrong with knowing the difference between good and evil? Did we miss something here? Isn't that what every parent wishes for his or her child? Parents who worry about their teenagers, you know what we mean. Why does eating from a tree that gives you the knowledge of good and evil carry the death penalty? If this is a story about the first humans, this part of the story sticks out like a sore thumb. But if we think of the Adam story as a preview of the story of Israel, it makes a lot more sense. Knowing the difference between good and evil is the point of the law in the Old Testament. The law given to Moses on Mount Sinai tells Israel what is good and what is evil. And if they obeyed what the law said, it went well with them, which we already saw meant that they would be able to stay in the land. If they disobeyed, it would lead to consequences, ultimately exile from the land. This was the big choice Israel faced in its history: obey the law and be blessed with land, disobey and forfeit the land. The book of Proverbs is based on a similar idea, although it is described a bit differently. The book of Proverbs, before we get to all of those wonderfully pithy, wise sayings, sets up a similar choice in the first 9 chapters. Israel is advised in Proverbs to follow wisdom and to flee from foolishness. What is wisdom? Obeying God and following God's instruction. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. Following the path of God leads to wisdom and life. Chapter 8, verse 35. But following foolishness leads to death. Chapter 8, verse 36. Knowing right from wrong, knowing wisdom from foolishness, is what was expected of Israel. And to gain that knowledge, they needed to learn to obey God. The book of Proverbs was written as a sort of training manual to do just that. God didn't command Adam and Eve not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil because such knowledge is wrong. It's not that God didn't ever want Adam and Eve to know good and evil. That is precisely what God did want for them. But they have to go about gaining such knowledge God's way. Obedience to God is the prerequisite for knowing good and evil. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7 puts it this way: the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. To use the language of Proverbs, Adam and Eve were fools. They spurned God's instruction and took the shortcut to get to what was intended to be a good thing. But true knowledge can only be gained by submitting to God, trusting, revering, and loving God, all included in that phrase, fear the Lord. And following God's path to wisdom brings life, which is what we read in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 18. She, wisdom, is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. Pursuing wisdom God's way leads to a tree of life for Israel and for Adam. Failure to follow God's path to wisdom leads to death, estrangement from God, exile for Israel and for Adam. Here's where the serpent comes in, chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. He is described as more crafty than any other animal that the Lord God has made. Verse 1. That's not just a snappy way to introduce a character in a story. In Proverbs chapter 1, verse 4, we read that God's wisdom gives shrewdness to the simple. Shrewdness in Proverbs and crafty in Genesis are the same Hebrew word. In English, crafty is the negative way of putting it, and shrewdness is the positive way. Think of shrewdness as street smarts. Someone who is shrewd won't be taken in by every shell game and card trick he passes on the street corner. Much of Proverbs is about preparing the young, the simple, the naive to make it in the world, where around every corner there is a potential temptation to drive them away from wisdom and life and toward foolishness and death. The brief dialogue that follows the serpent's entrance shows the crafty serpent outwitting simple Eve like a veteran car salesman manipulating a first-time buyer with a wad of cash. As most of us have learned the hard way, car salesmen know more about why we buy cars than we do. They study it. They go to seminars. They practice it. They are crafty. They look for a way into your head to get you to buy a car you may not really want, can't afford, and with features and warranties you might not need, and leave you feeling good and thinking it was all your idea. Until the payment booklet arrives and reality sets in. The buyer must truly beware. If you are naive, it is best that you not have a seat at the desk and crunch some numbers at all. Just keep away, and whatever you do, keep your mouth shut. The serpent is the crafty salesman, and Eve, the naive consumer. The serpent gets her talking, and within 2 verses, he has wrapped her around his finger and doubting God. Trust me, lady, God's lying to you. God's even a bit jealous. The reason God doesn't want you to eat of that wonderful, beautiful, delicious tree is because God knows that when you eat from it, you will become God like yourself, knowing good and evil. A clever half truth. Yes, if they eat of the tree, they will be like God, which is exactly what God wants. Eventually. God wants his human creatures to look more and more like God, but the wise God must lead them in God's way, in God's time. They are not ready to know good and evil. We all know from the classic Tom Hanks movie, Big, what happens when we grow up without all the experiences that come with maturity. In the same way, the serpent tricks naive Eve to grab for wisdom by bypassing God's instruction, to grab for a good thing the wrong way. And after they eat, Adam and Eve instantly become aware of their nakedness and are ashamed. Of all things that could have happened, the earth opening up and swallowing them whole, being struck down dead by fire from heaven, why this? It's almost like some uptight conservatives wrote this story. But that's not what's happening here. Think of young children. They tend to run around the house naked without a care in the world. In fact, our kids would even literally run around the house naked, completely oblivious to the embarrassment they were heaping on their helpless parents as the neighbors looked on. Children are naive, simple. They don't know they're supposed to feel shame. But imagine what would happen if, while your child was running amok, you could give her a magic cookie that would instantly give her the understanding of a 25-year-old, bypassing years of growth and experiences. Most likely, she would immediately scream, run into the bedroom, lock the door, and find something to cover herself, like the fig leaves Adam and Eve used. The serpent tricked Adam and Eve into gaining wisdom too soon, apart from God's way. They were naive children who did not have the shrewdness to withstand the serpent's craftiness. They should have trusted their Maker. The knowledge of good and evil isn't wrong, but getting it free from God's direction is death. Without the maturity that comes from obeying God, Adam and Eve can't handle the truth, said in our best Jack Nicholson, A Few Good Men voice. The point. This is the point of the story. The choice put before Adam and Eve is the same choice put before Israel every day. Learn to listen to God and follow God's ways, and then, only then, you will live. The story of Adam and Eve makes this point in the form of a myth. Proverbs makes it in the form of wisdom literature. Israel's long story in the Old Testament makes it in the form of historical narrative. The story of Adam and Eve is a preview of Israel's long journey in the Old Testament as a whole. Adam did not get back into the garden, but the Old Testament does not dwell on that story. In fact, Adam is not mentioned again in the Old Testament except for 1 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 1, where his is the first name in the long 9-chapter list of names. The Old Testament instead focuses on Israel itself, and Israel does come back to the garden, back to Canaan, in 539 BCE, about 50 years of captivity in Babylon. As we saw in Ezekiel chapter 37, the death of exile is reversed, and Israel's dead bones are brought back to life. Israel's estrangement from God is over. As the prophet Isaiah puts it, Jerusalem has served her term. Her penalty is paid. She has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. In chapter 40, verse 2. At the end of the day, Israel's national story is less about them and more about the God who never fully lets go of them, always moving to bring them back to paradise.